There's a certain peace that comes with living on the edge of town, a kind of quiet that makes you forget how loud the world really is. My property sat right at that border, half surrounded by rolling hills, half by the neighborhood run by our infamous HOA. And right at the heart of my front yard stood the oak tree. Massive, strong, older than the street itself. My father planted it when he first bought the land 40 years ago. I grew up climbing it, carving initials into it, building tree houses that barely survived a single summer. That tree wasn't just part of the yard, it was part of my family's story. Unfortunately, Karen didn't see it that way. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of the HOA community, president for 6 consecutive terms, and possibly allergic to minding her own business, had made it her personal mission to beautify the neighborhood. Her version of beautify meant every lawn had to look like it was copied from a magazine, and every house needed to match her beige and brick vision of perfection. My house didn't fit that mold. Too much character, too much shade, and according to Karen, too much tree. She'd started complaining at the HOA meetings months ago. "That oak of yours is a hazard, Jake," she said once, her voice slicing through the room like a mosquito that won't die. "The branches hang too low. They're dropping leaves on community grounds. It blocks the sidewalk view. It's an eyesore." I'd smiled politely. "Karen, the tree's been here longer than you. It's on my property line, and it's healthy. I've had it inspected." She gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that could curdle milk. "We'll see what the board has to say." The board, of course, was made up of Karen's coffee buddies, the same people who spent their weekends measuring fence heights and writing warning letters about mailbox colors. Weeks passed. Then I noticed the small things. HOA violation notices showing up in my mailbox, citing unapproved vegetation height, neighbors whispering about Karen's complaints at the community barbecue, and finally Karen herself standing on the edge of my driveway one morning, hands on hips, staring at the oak like it had personally insulted her. "Morning, Karen," I called out. "Admiring the view?" "Just checking on property compliance," she said coolly. "That tree is still dangerously close to the community sidewalk." "You mean the one that starts 10 feet from my yard?" "Boundaries can be subjective," she replied. That's when I realized this wasn't about safety or rules, it was about control. I started keeping an eye out. Every morning I'd spot her walking her tiny dog near my driveway, stopping just long enough to take photos of my house. She'd file complaints with the HOA about unapproved maintenance or tree debris. All of them baseless. But the point wasn't to win, it was to wear me down. But the more she pushed, the less I budged. Then, one Friday, something strange happened. I came home from work and saw orange spray paint markings at the base of the oak tree, little lines and numbers like the kind utility workers use before digging. At first I thought, maybe the city's doing maintenance? But the next day, I called the Public Works Department just to check. The guy on the phone said, "Sir, there are no scheduled works or permits in your area for at least a month." That's when it hit me. Someone else had made those marks. And I didn't have to guess who. Karen's obsession had reached new levels. Maybe she was trying to make it look like an official removal order. Maybe she wanted to scare me into cutting it down myself. But it was clear. She wasn't done. That night I walked outside and stood by the oak. The air was still, the sky turning orange from the sunset filtering through its branches. I ran my hand across the bark, the rough grooves warm from the day's heat. "This old tree's been here longer than anyone in this neighborhood," I muttered, "and it's not going anywhere." I set up a motion light facing the yard, just in case. Over the next few days, things felt tense. Karen didn't say much, but I could see the way she'd glare when she walked by. One morning, I caught her whispering to a couple of board members near the mailbox, glancing at my house and laughing. That's when my neighbor Mark stopped by. "Hey, Jake," he said, holding a mug of coffee. "You might want to keep an eye out. I overheard Karen talking to a tree service crew yesterday at the park." "Tree service?" "Yeah. She was saying something about getting it handled since the homeowner refuses." My stomach dropped. "Tell me she didn't..." Mark shook his head. I don't know, man, but she looked serious. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the yard from the window every few hours. It felt ridiculous, losing sleep over a tree, but it wasn't just a tree. It was about principle, about someone thinking they could rewrite the rules whenever they wanted. By Sunday morning, I convinced myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe she'd finally given up. I went about my day, brewed coffee, and started trimming the bushes by the porch. Then, just as I turned off the trimmer, I heard it. The distant growl of chainsaws. It was coming from my front yard. The sound hit me before I even reached the door. A deep, mechanical whirr of a chainsaw chewing through wood. It wasn't the occasional distant buzz of a neighbor trimming branches. No, this was close. Too close. I sprinted out of the house, my heart hammering, and froze mid-step. There in my yard stood two men in neon vests, revving their saws at the base of my oak tree. And standing a few feet behind them, arms folded, smug smile plastered across her face, was Karen. For a second, I couldn't even form words. The smell of gasoline and sawdust filled the air, and tiny flecks of bark sprayed in every direction. The orange markings from earlier were still visible, now carved into the soil where their boots dug in. "Hey! Hey!" I shouted, storming forward. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the workers, mid-40s, tired eyes, probably just hired muscle, glanced at me nervously. Ma'am said it was HOA-approved removal, said it was a safety hazard. We were told to clear it before the weekend storm. I looked straight at Karen, who had the nerve to smirk. "It is a safety hazard," she said matter-of-factly. "Overgrown over the sidewalk and technically infringing on HOA-maintained space. The board agreed it was time to remove it." "The board doesn't own my yard," I snapped. "You're trespassing, Karen. This tree is on private property. My property." She tilted her head, pretending to sympathize. "Jake, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's better for the community. Besides, we're doing you a favor. It'll raise your property value." "Raise my—" I almost laughed. "That tree's worth more than your entire flower garden." One of the chainsaws started again, and I lunged forward. "Turn it off!" I yelled. "Now!" The worker hesitated, looking between me and Karen. "Ma'am, we should maybe—" "Keep cutting," Karen barked. "You're authorized by the HOA." That's when something inside me snapped. "Authorized by who?" I stepped right between them and the trunk. "You touch this tree again, and I'll have every one of you arrested for destruction of private property." Karen rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." "Dramatic!" I pointed at the tree, bark peeling under the blade marks. "You forged an authorization, hired contractors, and stepped onto my land without consent. That's criminal trespass." The workers, realizing the situation had turned, shut off their saws and backed away. One muttered, "Ma'am, we're not getting involved in this. You didn't say it was private property." Karen tried to stop them. "Wait, we already started. Finish the job." But they were already packing their gear. "No way! We're not cutting a tree without a permit." And just like that, her little plan began to crumble. She turned to me, furious. "You've just made a huge mistake, Jake. I'll be calling the HOA board and the county. You'll see." "Do that," I said, "and I'll be calling the sheriff." She froze. The sheriff?" "That's right," I said calmly, pulling out my phone. "Let's see what they think of you hiring unlicensed workers to destroy property." Karen blanched but tried to recover her composure. "I was within my rights. That tree, it's a community risk." "You're about to find out who's really at risk," I said, dialing. She stormed off toward her SUV, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors. The workers drove off seconds later, leaving behind a half-mangled trunk and a pile of sawdust. I stood there for a moment, hands trembling, trying to calm my breathing. Mark, my neighbor, appeared at the fence, eyes wide. "Holy crap, Jake. Did she seriously?" "Yup," I said bitterly. "Tried to have it chopped while I was home." "That woman's insane," he said. "You really calling the cops?" "You bet I am." I called the sheriff's office and explained the situation. Unauthorized contractors, property damage, trespassing. They said an officer would be dispatched to take a report. I felt some relief just hearing that. But the relief didn't last long. 2 hours later, I was standing in the yard with a deputy when Karen returned, this time dragging along 2 of her HOA board members for backup. She strutted over like she owned the street. "Officer," she began sweetly, "there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply enforcing HOA maintenance codes. That tree was—" The deputy raised a hand. "Ma'am, the property line is clearly marked, and this tree is entirely within Mr. Hayes's land. You had no authority to order its removal." Karen's expression twisted. "But the HOA—" "The HOA doesn't override property law," the deputy interrupted. "And if those contractors damage the tree or property, you could be liable for the costs." Mark couldn't resist muttering, "Told you, Karen." She shot him a death glare, then turned back to the officer. "This is absurd. You're taking his side because—" "Ma'am," the deputy said firmly, "drop it, or we'll be taking statements down at the station." For a moment she looked ready to explode, but then, with one final scoff, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her car, slamming the door hard enough to make the window rattle. The tires screeched as she sped off. The deputy sighed and turned to me. "We'll file a report. I'd recommend getting a professional assessment on the tree. If it's damaged beyond saving, she'll owe you for replacement or restoration." "Thanks, officer," I said, shaking his hand. "Appreciate you coming out." "No problem. You'd be surprised how often HOA disputes end up like this." As he drove away, I looked up at the oak, still standing but scarred. Its bark was gouged deep where the chainsaw bit into it. I touched the wound, feeling both relief and anger. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because if I knew Karen, and unfortunately I did, she wasn't going to let this go quietly. And neither was I. The next morning, the air was still heavy with sawdust and resentment. I'd barely slept. From my porch, I could see the old oak leaning slightly, its bark carved and splintered where Karen's crew had tried to finish it off. It looked like a wounded soldier refusing to fall. I sipped my coffee and thought about calling a tree specialist. Before I could, the familiar sound of Karen's SUV echoed up the street. That throaty growl she loved to announce her arrival. She slowed in front of my driveway, rolled her window down, and glared. "You know," she called out, "that tree's going to collapse any day now. Don't come crying to the HOA when it wrecks something." "Don't worry," I said. "If it does, I'll send the bill straight to you." She scoffed and drove off toward the clubhouse, probably to rally the board. I figured that was the end of it for the day. But the oak had other plans. By noon, the wind had picked up, a quick-moving storm rolling across the valley. Branches swayed, leaves scattered like confetti. I decided to check the rope bracing I'd tied around the trunk. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. Karen's SUV wasn't in her driveway. Instead, a white sedan I didn't recognize was parked there. Shiny, official-looking. Mark appeared from his yard, phone in hand. "Hey, did you see all the activity down the street? Sheriff's office doing some routine patrols." I nodded. "Maybe they're keeping an eye on the HOA after yesterday." Lightning flickered, followed by a rumble. I glanced up. The oak creaked, a deep groaning sound that made the hair on my arms rise. A few smaller branches snapped off and thudded to the ground. "Hang in there, buddy," I muttered. "You've survived worse." And then came the crack, a thunderous crack that split the air. The trunk, weakened by the chainsaw gouge, gave way. I jumped back as the massive limb tore free, twisting in midair before crashing down with a bone-shaking thud. For a few stunned seconds, I thought it had landed in my yard. But when the dust settled, I saw it. The branch hadn't fallen toward my house. It had landed across the street, right on top of the white sedan. Mark blinked. "Dude, tell me that's not—" We both hurried closer, rain pelting down now. The shattered windshield reflected blue lights that had just flickered on, hidden in the car's grill. "Oh no," I whispered. "That's a sheriff's cruiser." Before I could even process that, Karen's SUV came screeching around the corner. She jumped out, staring in horror at the tree limb crushing the roof of the county vehicle. "What did you do?" she screamed. "You've destroyed police property!" I almost laughed. "I didn't do anything. Maybe the universe finally got tired of your HOA rules." Karen turned toward me, drenched and trembling with rage. "This is on you! That tree was dangerous! I told you!" "Which you made worse by hacking it in half yesterday," I shot back. "Congratulations, Karen. That's called cause and effect." Two deputies sprinted up from the end of the street, shouting over the rain. One of them looked at the car, then at Karen, who was already trying to play innocent. "Officer, it was him," she cried. "He refused to remove this hazard even after the HOA ordered it gone." The taller deputy narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, you ordered work done on his property without a permit yesterday, correct?" Karen blinked. "Well, yes, but..." "Then you interfered with a private tree, compromised its structure, and it fell onto county property. That's negligence." Her jaw dropped. "You can't possibly mean I'm responsible for that. It's a tree." "A tree you tampered with," the deputy said, jotting notes. "We'll need you to come down to the station for a statement." The other deputy was inspecting the crushed hood. "That's the sheriff's personal car," he muttered. "He's not going to be happy about this." Karen went pale. "To the sheriff's car?" Lightning flashed again, perfectly punctuating the moment. I couldn't help the grin that spread across my face. "Guess your HOA budget's about to take a hit." The deputies exchanged looks, then started calling in a tow truck and insurance adjuster. Mark whispered, "This is better than reality TV." Karen tried to recover her dignity, straightening her soaked cardigan. "This isn't over, Jake. I'll have you sued for defamation." "Go ahead," I said. "But maybe call your lawyer from the station." She glared daggers as the deputies escorted her toward the patrol car. One of them turned back to me. "Mr. Hayes will file an incident report, but from what we can see, this was an act of nature worsened by her interference. You're in the clear." I nodded. "Appreciate it, officer. And tell the sheriff I'll help cover the tow." He smiled. "Something tells me he'll appreciate your honesty more than her maintenance plan." When they drove off, Karen slumped in the back seat. Drenched and defeated, I finally exhaled. Mark clapped me on the shoulder. "Dude, if that's not karma, I don't know what is." "Yeah," I said, staring at the fallen branch. "Maybe the tree decided to defend itself." For a moment, the wind died down. The remaining part of the oak swayed gently, almost proud. I couldn't help smiling. The neighborhood might still be ruled by HOA nonsense, but for once, nature had taken my side. And the best part? The sheriff wasn't exactly known for being forgiving when his car got damaged. Something told me this was only the beginning of Karen's real problems. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Karen's name was everywhere, whispered by dog walkers, gossiped over fences, and posted all over the HOA group chat like wildfire. "Did you hear? The tree fell on a cop car. Karen's the one who cut it. I heard it was the sheriff's own ride." By 9 a.m., 3 local news vans had already parked on the corner, hoping for a soundbite. The HOA board tried to put out a statement, but half the comments under their post were memes of trees wearing badges. I was inside making coffee when there was a knock on the door, sharp, confident, official. When I opened it, there stood Sheriff Daniels himself. Broad shoulders, aviator sunglasses, hat tucked under his arm. The man looked like every small-town legend rolled into one. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," he said, voice calm but heavy. "Mind if I take a look at the crime scene?" "Not at all, Sheriff," I said, stepping aside. "Though I'd call it karma more than a crime." He smirked slightly. "We'll see about that." We walked to the yard where the fallen oak still lay across the crushed remains of his patrol car. The tow truck had hauled the wreck overnight, but the muddy tire tracks told the story well enough. Daniels crouched down, tracing his fingers along the saw marks on the trunk. He didn't need long to piece it together. "Looks like someone took a chainsaw to the base, not a full cut, but deep enough to weaken it." That'd be Karen, I said. She had a landscaping crew do it without my permission. He stood, exhaling slowly. You got any proof of that? I pointed toward Mark's porch, where my ever-curious neighbor already had his phone ready. Mark's your guy. He filmed everything, from her yelling at me to her crew slicing up the trunk. Mark waved and shouted, "Got the full HD version, Sheriff, even zoomed in on her HOA badge like it meant something." The sheriff gave a dry chuckle. "Appreciate it. I'll need that footage for evidence." Then he turned, expression darkening. "And where's the lady herself?" Almost like she'd been summoned, Karen appeared at the end of her driveway, hair frazzled, sunglasses barely hanging on, clutching a clipboard like a shield. Behind her, a few other HOA board members were whispering nervously, pretending not to stare. "Sheriff Daniels," she called out, "I've been meaning to speak with you. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding." "You're right about that," he said, walking toward her. "The misunderstanding being that you thought you could order work done on private property without consent." Karen blinked, caught off guard. Well, the HOA bylaws clearly state that unmaintained trees—" "That tree was healthy until your people cut into it," he interrupted, "and you damaged a county vehicle in the process." Her voice cracked. "But how was I supposed to know it would fall that way?" "That's what happens when you play lumberjack with other people's property," he said, crossing his arms. "And just so we're clear, the car it hit wasn't just a patrol unit. It was mine." Her face drained of color. Yours?" The entire street went silent. Even the wind paused. Karen stammered, "Sheriff, you have to believe me. I was just trying to enforce HOA safety regulations. That tree was a hazard." "A hazard you created," he said firmly. "And now you're facing charges for property damage, trespassing, and reckless endangerment." One of the deputies walked up with a folder. "We've already taken statements from witnesses, sir. Video evidence checks out." Karen looked around desperately, her fellow board members suddenly finding excuses to walk away. "You can't arrest me for doing my job," she snapped. "Lady," the sheriff said, sliding on his aviators, "your job doesn't include vandalizing private property." Mark muttered behind me, "Oh, that's going in the HOA newsletter for sure." As the deputies approached, Karen's panic reached full volume. "This is ridiculous. I'm the president of the HOA. You'll regret this." "Ma'am," one deputy said, trying not to laugh, "you have the right to remain silent. You might want to use it." They escorted her toward the squad car. Poetic justice, considering she'd spent years calling the cops on neighbors for grass height violations. The sheriff turned back to me once she was inside. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the department, I apologize for the mess. We'll take care of the damages." "No apology needed, Sheriff," I said with a grin. "The Oak handled things better than I ever could." He chuckled. "Still, I owe you one. Maybe I'll bring the department by for your next barbecue." "You're always welcome," I said. "Just don't park under the trees." That actually got a laugh out of him, the kind that echoed down the street as the deputies drove off. Karen's furious face pressed against the window like a child denied candy. Mark raised his coffee mug from across the yard. "To poetic justice." I lifted mine back. "And to HOA-free living. Someday." We both laughed, and as the clouds cleared, the sunlight hit the old oak stump. It looked peaceful now, almost proud, like it had stood its ground to the very end. For once, the street felt quiet, calm, and completely free of HOA drama, at least until the next Karen incident hit.